I've talked before about a story that Matthew Franklin Whittier wrote, as I believe in 1830 or thereabouts, called The New Year's Bells. It ended up in a compilation published by Francis Duravage, Matthew's plagiarist. It's called, the compilation is called Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. Three Brides, I think, was written by Duravage. It's rather mean. The rest of it is all Matthew Franklin Whittier's work. I'm not going to go into the background and the evidence for all of that. What I'm going to do is to read this story or excerpts from it and compare those excerpts to A Christmas Carol, which Matthew and Abby were the real and original authors of. Evidently, they used this story, The New Year's Bells, as a template when they started working on A Christmas Carol. And I don't use the word lightly when I say template. This is not a matter of being inspired by something, or maybe there's some possible connections or possible similarities. I mean a template. So that story appears next to last, way in the back of this book. This is published 1853. Christmas Carol, of course, was published 1843. And this is the 1845 edition. It was rebound in the typical marble 19th century binding. And some of the illustrations have been replaced and so on. And even then, it was rather pricey. Normal person can't touch a first edition of this book. But we got back to pretty close. So I've got my notes here. What I'm going to do is read the excerpts. Of course, I can't mark these excerpts start and stop in the books themselves. So I'm going to have to pause and kind of look and see where it is that I wanted to finish up with each excerpt. And then I'll have to just cut in between with those pauses. But so you'll see in that, and I won't read perfectly, so you'll see quite a bit of dissolves in this, and I apologize for that, but trying to make it presentable. I will make a little bit of commentary, a few comments where it's relevant, but not too much. I basically just want to read straight through this. So the first one, we're going to go to page 399 of this compilation for New Year's Bells. We're a couple pages into it. And the gist of this is that a miser named Israel Worm is evicting a tenant. And this particular tenant is kind of a special tenant because her husband used to be his boyhood friend. And then the situation was reversed, that the friend was wealthy and Israel Worm was poor. And now that the friend has died, his widow is desperately poor, and Israel Worm is kicking her out of her apartment or house in the middle of winter with her children, who are just recovering from some illness, see? So we're going to start where the widow is telling him that she can't believe he's going to kick her out. "You want the money. Is it possible? Report speaks you rich." "It's false, false," said the old man bitterly. "I'm poor. I'm pinched. Ask the townspeople how I live. Do I look like a rich man? No, no, I tell you, I want my dues, and I will have 'em." "I can't pay you," said the woman sadly. "Then you must abide the consequences." "What consequences?" "I've got an execution, that's all," said the hard-hearted landlord. "An execution? What's that?" "A warrant to take all your goods." "My goods," said the poor woman, looking round her with a melancholy smile. "Why, I have nothing but what few things you see in this room. You surely wouldn't take those." "I'll take all I can get." "And leave me here with the bare walls." "No, no, you walk out of this tomorrow." "In the depth of winter?" "You cannot be so hard-hearted." "We shall see that." "I care not for myself. But what is to become of these poor children?" "Send them to work in the factory." "But they are just recovering from sickness. They are too young to work. Oh, where can we go?" "To the poorhouse," said the landlord fiercely. The poor woman rose, and approaching the landlord's feet, fell upon her knees, clasped her hands, and looked upward in his stern and unrelenting face. "Israel Worm," she said, "has your heart grown as hard as the nether millstone? Have you forgotten the days of old lang syne? Oh, remember that we were once prosperous and happy. Remember that misfortune and not sin has reduced me and mine to the deplorable state in which you find us. Remember that my husband was your early friend, your schoolfellow, your playmate. Remember that when he was rich and you poor, he gave you from his plenty, freely, bountifully, not gave with the expectation of a return. His gifts were bounties, not loans. Therefore I owed him nothing, said the obdurate miser, turning away. You shall hear me out, said the woman, starting to her feet. I ask for a further delay. I ask you to stay the hard hand of the law. You profess to be a Christian. I demand justice and mercy in the name of those sleeping innocents, my poor grandchildren, whose Father is in heaven. You shall be merciful. Heyday, exclaimed the miser, this is fine talk, upon my word. You demand justice, do you? Well, you shall have it. The law is on my side, and I will carry it out to the letter. Now we turn to A Christmas Carol. This is page 12 of A Christmas Carol. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? They are. Still, returned the gentleman, I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then? Said Scrooge. Both are very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time, of all others, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. So you're seeing some similarities, but don't assume that this is all I've got. I think people do that, and they sign off, and they think, oh, that's all he's got. Wait, be patient. Now, we are turning to my second example. This is on page 401 of the 1853 book. With a bitter curse upon his lips, but trembling and dismayed in spite of himself, Israel Worm left the presence of the indignant victim of his cruelty and turned his footsteps in the direction of his home. His home! It scarcely deserved the name. There was no fire there to thaw his chilled and trembling frame, no light to gleam athwart the darkness and send forth its pilgrim rays to meet him and guide his footsteps to his threshold. No wife, no children waited eagerly his return. It was the miser's home, dark, desolate, stern, and repulsive. Its deep cellars, its thick walls held hidden stores of gold and notes and bonds, but there were garnered up no treasures of the heart. The miser's path lay through the churchyard, a desolate place enough even in the gay noon of a midsummer day, now doubly repulsive in the wild midnight of midwinter. The wall was ruinous. The black iron gateway frowned naked and ominous. So that gives us an idea of some similarities between those two works, but there's much, much more. Now, we're getting into A Christmas Carol. When I say more, I mean more specific. So now we go to page 18 of A Christmas Carol. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in the lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and have forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. I believe that's where I wanted to stop. Now, there's some notes I've made here. There's a couple figures given that are real typical for Matthew. Matthew was a philosopher. He was a humorist. He tended to put in these analogies. And when he talks about the idea that the house must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with the other houses, that's typical Matthew. And this business about the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Genius, you know, is like the guiding higher principle or higher mind. That means that this was written by a mystic, or in Matthew's case, somebody who was being tutored by a mystic. Well, if you get into Charles Dickens, and Dickens was not a mystic, okay, so there's a problem here. If you get into Charles Dickens' handwritten draft, it's probably not his first draft, it's probably the third draft, but you can find it online. You can see where he made heavy changes and where he didn't. And even though this may be the third draft, still it gives you some idea of what might have been original, you know, and what was changed by him. Well, these two figures concerning the house playing hide and seek and the genius of the weather sitting in mournful meditation have not been changed. They were original, at least as of the third draft, and I would say that Matthew wrote them. It's just a little tiny bit of evidence for us. Now, keep in mind, if you look at that, you'll see quite a bit has been changed. So what Dickens did, if you look carefully at the changes he made, he strung it out. He stuck more words in there, more verbiage. Matthew was a tighter writer, more terse writer, which of course is considered a better writer these days. But Dickens would go in and add things, you know, just to lengthen, pad the sentence. Basically, he went through and padded it. He also toned it down spiritually where Abby had written it, but that's something for another day. We're not getting into that today. So now we go to the third example. This is page 402 in the Durivage compilation of the New Year's bells. Suddenly he saw before him the well-known figure of the old sexton of the village, busily occupied in digging a grave. The winter had passed away. It was now midsummer. The birds were singing in the trees, and from the far green meadows sounded the low of cattle and the tinkling of sheep bells. This is a vision now. Even the graveyard looked no longer desolate, for on many of the little hillocks bright flowers were springing into bloom and verdure, attesting the affection that outlived death, and decorating with living bloom the precincts of decay. "My friend, for whom are you digging that grave?" asked Israel. The sexton looked up from his work, but did not seem to recognize the spokesman. "For a man that died last night. He is to be buried today." "Methinks this haste is somewhat indecorous," said Israel Worm. "Oh, for the matter of that," said the sexton, "the sooner this fellow's out of the way, the better. There's nobody to mourn for him." "Is he a pauper, then?" "Oh, no, he was immensely rich." "And he had no relations? No friends?" "For relations, he had a nephew who inherits all his property. The young dog will make the money fly, I tell you. As for friends, he had none. The poor dreaded him. The good despised him, for he was a hard-hearted, selfish, gripping man. In a word, he was a miser," said the sexton. A miser, faltered the trembling dreamer. What was his name? Israel Worm, replied the sexton. Okay, so that might start ringing a bell to you. All right, now we go to A Christmas Carol. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, a worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, said Scrooge, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of the things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead, said Scrooge. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Now we're getting into some pretty close parallels. There's a couple of things I wanted to point out here. First of all, this is a philosophical passage. Dickens was not a philosopher. Mathew was. Abby was. Secondly, we have this business about worthy, a worthy place. Mathew liked irony. He loved to say that he was disappointed in something, and then as it went on, it turned out he was disappointed in the positive direction. He was disappointed, which is to say that it was actually way better than he thought it was going to be. And he used that several times. Well, here he's using the reverse. He says that the graveyard was a worthy place, and then he reveals that what he means is it was absolutely appropriate for Scrooge. See? So that's very typical of Mathew's writing. Now we go to the fourth example. We're going to page 403 if anybody wants to look up this book. Graveyard and Sexton faded away. In their place arose a splendid grove of trees, a clearing, a village schoolhouse. Two boys were sauntering along the roadside, engaged in serious childish talk. One was fair, with golden locks, the other dark-haired and grave of aspect. Israel started, for in the latter he recognized himself, a boy of 50 years ago. Israel, said the golden-haired boy, it's election day tomorrow. We'll hire Browning's horse and chaise, and go to Boston, and have a grand time on the Common, seeing all the shows. You forget, Mark, said the dark-haired boy, sadly, that I have no money. What of that, replied the other. I have a pocketful, and what's mine is yours, you know. Come, cheer up. You'll one day be as rich as I am, and then it will be your turn to treat, you know. I can afford to be generous, and so would you be if you had the means. Then the shadow passed from the face of the dark-haired boy, and a smile lighted up his countenance, and the two schoolfellows passed on their way together. Grove and schoolhouse passed away, melting into another scene, like one of the dissolving views. Now, I looked that up. In 1830, actually dissolving views, meaning like a dissolved transition in a video, dissolving views as slides, that was invented in 1804 and was quite popular by 1830. So there's no question that this could go back to 1830. Mathew was fascinated by technology. There's another section here we're not going to read where he gets into magnification and things of that nature, and a lecture using slides, scientific lecture. So this is all typical of Mathew. Now we go to A Christmas Carol. We're going to page 46. I am a mortal, Scrooge remonstrated, and liable to fall. Bear but a touch of my hand there, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. This is Abby's writing. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. "Good heavens," said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts, driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but the shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." Then we're going to move to page 57. "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick." Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." Now, I have to mention that when Mathew and Abby wrote A Christmas Carol, or started writing it, I believe this was in 1838. I believe that they were living for a month or two with his second cousin, Richard Whittier, in Methuen, Massachusetts. That building is now the Historical Society in Methuen. You can go there. I went there, and upstairs there's a small bedroom, and I felt very strongly. I had a lot of emotion there, and I felt that that was where Mathew and Abby recovered from the loss of their 11-month-old son, Joseph. So they would have wanted to embed a tribute to Dick Whittier in this. And I think what they did was to call him Dick Wilkins. So nobody else would know who it was, but he would know who it was. And if you go back into Dickens' handwritten draft, you will find that that was original, at least as of whatever draft that was. It's not changed. Dickens didn't change it. Apparently he thought Dick Wilkins was a good enough name and he left it in. Now we're going back to the New Year's bells. We're going to go to page 405. And this is kind of interesting. After the science lecture, Israel Worm finds himself in hell. Now that we see when he's writing by himself. We don't see that in A Christmas Carol. So I think Abby didn't believe in that, or she didn't want to talk about it or something. I think it's Abby's influence, because I think the deal was, Mathew would write Scrooge and some of the other stuff, but Abby would write the spirits and the supernatural part of it, because she had experience in that area. She was deeply studied in that area. So she did not have Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, in hell. But here, Mathew has Israel Worm in hell briefly. So we began. The illuminated disk grew dark and disappeared. Then a lurid light seemed to fill all space, and soon huge billows of flames rolled upward and writhed and twisted together like a myriad of gigantic serpents. Shrieks and howls of anguish issued from the fiery mass, but above all was heard the startling clangor of a bell. "Halloo, who's this?" cried a voice that evidently issued from a set of powerful human lungs. The miser felt himself roughly shaken by the shoulder and awoke. "What's the noise? Fire?" he asked, for the bell he had heard in his dream now jarred upon his waking senses. "Fire? No," said the man who had awakened him. the butcher of the village. "It's the boys ringing in the new year. By the way, I wish you a happy new year, Mr. Worm." "A happy new year, Mr. Worm," said the schoolmaster, for he too was present. "A happy new year," said Farmer Harrowby. "And a happy new year," chorused a dozen other voices. It was great fun wishing a miser a happy new year. "Thank you, neighbors. I wish you 1,000, replied Israel cheerfully. "How came you asleep there?" asked Farmer Harrowby. "Why, you might have perished in the drift." "I was overcome by drowsiness," answered Israel. "I was very cold. I'd been to make a call on Widow Redmond, and the poor soul was out of wood. By the way, Farmer, the first thing after sunrise, I want you to be sure to gear up your ox team and take a cord of your best hickory and pitch pine to the widow." "And who'll pay me?" asked the farmer, doubtfully. "I will, to be sure," answered Israel. "Have I not got money enough? Here, hold your hand." And he put a handful of silver in the farmer's honest palm. "And you, Mr. Wilkins," he added, addressing the butcher, "take her the best turkey you've got, and half a pig, with my compliments, and a happy new year to her." "And how about that execution?" asked the constable, who was round with the rest, seeing the old year out and the new year in. "Confound the execution! Don't let me hear another word about it," said Israel magnanimously. "And now, neighbors," he added, "I owe you something for your good wishes. Come along with me to the Golden Lion, and I'll give you the best supper the tavern affords. Hurrah! New Year don't come but once in a 12th month." We will be bound that a merrier party never left a churchyard, even after a funeral, nor a merrier set ever sat down to a festal board than that which gathered to greet the hospitality of Israel Worm. In the course of the evening, an old Scotch gardener gave it as his opinion that, quote, "the miser was fey," in parentheses, when a man suddenly changes his character, as when a spendthrift becomes saving, or a niggard generous. The Scotch say that he is fey, and consider the change a forerunner of sudden death. "No, my friends," said Israel, overhearing the remark, "I am not fey, and I mean to live a long while, heaven willing, for I have just learned that the true secret of enjoying life is to do good to others. I had a dream tonight which has, I trust, made me a wiser and better man. The miser lies buried in yonder churchyard. Israel Worm, a new man, has risen in his place. And as far as my means go, I intend that this shall be a happy new year to every one of my acquaintances." So then, I'm sure you're going to recognize what part of A Christmas Carol fits with this. In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. "I will live in the past, the present, and the future," Scrooge repeated, as he scrambled out of bed. "The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees." He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. "They are not torn down," cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. "They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will be." His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. "I don't know what to do," cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect Laocoon of himself with his stockings. "I am as light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. I am as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello here, whoop, hello." And moving forward a little bit. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist. Clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold. Cold piping for the blood to dance to, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. Eh? Returned the boy, with all his might of wonder. What's today, my fine fellow? Said Scrooge. Today, replied the boy. Why, Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day, said Scrooge to himself. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, say, fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner? Scrooge inquired. I should hope I did, replied the lad. An intelligent boy, said Scrooge. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. What? The one as big as me? Returned the boy. What a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck. It's hanging there now, replied the boy. Is it? Said Scrooge. Go and buy it. Walker, exclaimed the boy. No, no, said Scrooge. I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a shot off half so fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be. Now, this is Matthew's sense of humor. This is Matthew's writing. I've got 2,300 examples of Matthew's writing. I'm telling you, that's his style, these jokes, these references. Humorous philosophy. And Joe Miller was a joke book. It was popular on both sides of the Atlantic. Could have been either of them, but Matthew is a humorist by profession, okay? Okay, now we get to the last paragraph, and anybody who's stuck with me, we now have a verbatim comparison. I'm not saying this lightly. I mean, we have a verbatim comparison. We're now in the New Year's bells. This is the last paragraph. Israel was as good as his word and never relapsed into his old habits. The widow and the orphan children were provided for by his bounty. He gave liberally to every object of charity. Hospitals, schools, and colleges were the recipients of his bounty. And when he died, in the fullness of years, the blessings of old and young followed him to his last resting place in the old churchyard where he had dreamed the mysterious dream and had been awakened to a better life by the pealing of the New Year's bells. And we go now to the second to last paragraph in A Christmas Carol. This was the original ending. This was Mathew and Abby's original ending, and I'll show you why I say that. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite good enough for him. Now, Mathew Whittier and Abby Whittier were terribly shunned and marginalized. They were persecuted. I have evidence for this. I'm not just guessing it. Abby was persecuted as a witch. Mathew and Abby were both persecuted for coming out publicly against slavery as abolitionists, and they were laughed at. This was autobiographical. This was personal. It does not fit with the character of Scrooge, because Scrooge might be laughed at briefly for being unlike his usual self, but he was laughed at for being a miser. He would have been celebrated and appreciated for being generous. So Scrooge was not in a position to be laughed at for being good. That's autobiographical. It does not match the character, see, and nor does it match Charles Dickens, see, because Charles Dickens was a famous, like a rock star, a literary rock star who was accustomed to lauds and honors and applause. He was not marginalized. He wasn't in that position of being laughed at for doing good, see. So it fits Matthew and Abby. It does not fit Scrooge, and it does not fit Charles Dickens. Now, you'll see that in the New Year's Bells, he says, Israel Worm was as good as his word. Matthew did that earlier. There's another little story also stolen by Francis Durbage in which the last paragraph says he was as good as his word. That was original, I think. I think that's what it said in the Christmas Carol. And Dickens thought it would sound better, even better, if he said Scrooge was better than his word. But here's the truth. What this means, being as good as your word, means that you walk the walk. You talk the talk and walk the walk, and your word is good. See, it means that you do what you say you're going to do. Therefore, it's meaningless to ramp it up and say better than your word. There is no such thing as being better than your word. So Dickens, being a hypocrite, didn't really understand what that meant, that phrase. So he just thought he would amplify it, So if the original writer said he was as good as his word, I'm going to make it even better and say he was better than his word, which is nonsense. So Dickens changed that. If I'm right about that, it means that Mathew Franklin Whittier used this exact same ending 3 times. Twice in pieces that were stolen by Francis Durbage and once in a piece that was stolen by Charles Dickens. So the ending that Dickens tacked on, as I believe, is also kind of interesting. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the capital's total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us every one, in all caps. Well, Abby was describing spirit guides, what would today in the New Age be called spirit guides. She would have advocated that everybody get in touch with their spirit guides and continue to listen to their spirit guides. She would never have written anything about renouncing your spirit guides as though they were alcohol with the total abstinence principle. But Charles Dickens was in a position where, in order to get Christians to read this, he had to emphasize that this was just a ghost story. So he had to have Scrooge renounce all the spirits as though this was just a dream, see? So that's why he put that in there. Matthew never ended it that way. Their ending, and if you read it, you'll see that this second to last paragraph is quite adequate as an ending, see? So Dickens tacked on another ending. So there's also relatively few changes in the handwritten draft in these last 2 paragraphs. If you look at them, I'll put them up on the screen here. So what it means is the next to last paragraph he liked, and he just modified a little bit. If I'm correct about the very beginning sentence of that, and he modified that earlier, because this is probably the 3rd draft. And there's very few changes in the last paragraph, which he wrote himself, because, of course, he wrote it himself. So I don't really know how to wrap this up because the thing is so self-evident. This is the frustration that I have. People want proof. I hand them proof on a silver platter, and they don't pay any attention. Nobody tells anybody else. Nobody calls. Nobody writes. Nobody invites me to anything. Even though I have handed the proof to you, this comparison in itself, if it's not enough to prove that Mathew and Abby wrote A Christmas Carol, if it's not enough to prove that Charles Dickens didn't originally write A Christmas Carol, but was just a popularizer, it's enough to cause a serious discussion worldwide about this. It's solid enough to seriously bring the matter up for discussion. And that it has not come up for discussion is a serious problem in terms of the dedication of academia and scholars to the truth. Because if they were interested in the truth, they would have jumped on this and there would be a serious discussion, and I would be getting invited to speak to classes on Zoom and to go to conventions and to write papers. Well, I have submitted a paper about this to a major scholastic journal. I haven't heard anything. We will see about that. But the point is that there's something irrational going on with academia as a whole, that I give them evidence this good and they don't want to talk about it. See? It's not the first time that academia has put its head in the sand, but I'm telling you it's happening here with this. So I hope you found that interesting. The next thing I'm going to do is to sit down without notes and just tell you how it went down, how Charles Dickens ended up with the credit for A Christmas Carol, how the manuscript got in his hands, how Mathew and Abby wrote it, how it got in his hands, and how he ended up publishing it and claiming it. I'm going to tell you that whole story. It might take me an hour or so, I'm not sure, but I'm going to be doing that a little closer to Christmas. And then there's a story written by Abby that's a different kind of a Christmas story that I think it might be fun just to read all the way through. If you want to see me read this story, New Year's Bells, I did that back on July 26th. I'll put the link below this video.